The other day, I went and visited my grandma at the old people care home she lives at, and we were talking, having general conversation. I asked how bingo went, I asked her how arts and crafts class went, and then there was a pause in conversation, and she said the most like left field thing to me. She said, "Cal,
do you worship Satan or something?"
To which I was like vaguely stunned and taken back by this. And I was like, "No, Grandma. No, I do not worship Satan. I don't even believe in Satan." To which she kind of nodded and she was like, "Good, because I thought you were a goth that
worshipped Satan."
And I was like, "Huh? Hold up 1 second." But before I could continue that line of thought and wonder what was going on there, why my grandma thought goths worship Satan, why she even thought I was a goth. And side note, this is what I was wearing that day. All black, I suppose, to like elderly relative. That I guess I do look kind of goth. But no, I'm not part of that faction, that team. I simply just wear a lot of all black because it requires no thought process and typically always looks good. It's just a safe bet fashion-wise. But back to the point, before I could question her line of thought and wonder why she thought goths meant you supported Satan, the conversation changed, and before I knew it, it was time for feeding time at the care home, where we have to leave our grandma so she can go eat with the other elderly people. And then in the car ride home, I was like to my mum, "Why do you reckon grandma thought I was a satanic worshipper, and why do you reckon she thinks goths are satanic?" And she was like, "Well, Cal, she's from an era where there's a thing called satanic panic, and there was a lot of like hysteria and baseless claims around people that just didn't fit the conventional norm of how people should look and act." And I was like, that sounds incredibly interesting. So I went ahead and started Googling and researching this stuff. And there's a whole history on this era called the Satanic Panic era. And basically there was just a crazy amount of demonizing and moral panic around anything that people just couldn't get straight away. But before we do get into this wild conversation of goth and Satanism and satanic practices, are they practicing crazy rituals, or are they just listening to music in their room, just trying to go about their own life? Probably the latter. But before we get into this conversation and how this came about and how these assumptions got made, let me introduce myself just so I'm not some random person talking at you on the internet for the next 20-30 minutes or whatever. My name is Cal, and on this channel we do videos typically talking about subcultures or fandoms, exploring them and the nuances around them, and then we will discuss it as a team down in the comment section below. So if that sounds like fun for you, please feel free to subscribe and join this community type thing we've got going on. Okay, cool, with that out of the way, let's get on with the video. So today we're going to break down one of the biggest misconceptions ever about the goth subculture. The idea that it was ever truly satanic. Goths, Satanism, satanic rituals, what do they all have in common? Words. That's pretty much it. But back in the day, if you wore all black and listened to music outside of the norm, there was a good chance people would think you're up to some unholy satanic activities in your spare time. And even in the early 2000s, this was a thing I can attest to. Being a little emo kid back in the day, people would have all sorts of wild images conjured up about me, things I had never or even think to do, but they would assume I would be like that because I was wearing all black and I didn't look like everybody else in the playground. Non-school uniform day was a hell pit where they'd basically round up all the emo kids and just ask them the most rude and vulgar questions. Why? Because they were different to everybody else. However, this was no new phenomenon. In the 80s, goths, anyone that was a bit dark and mysterious in aesthetic, was basically judged to be a witch, and they must be put in the water with this big boulder attached to them at dawn because they are not safe and they are communing with the devil. This is not me hyperbolizing, this is how they genuinely treated anyone that wasn't part of the conventional conservative norm, anything that kind of challenged generic ideologies. If you rocked a pentagram in the 80s, well, you were basically saying, "I'm voting for Satan to take over the government and roll on Satan's wishes," and you breathe fire, and I don't know, you got some cool wings. Anyways, I'm not trying to sell it to you. I'm just trying to say there was a lot of moral panic. However, conversely, now in like 2025, It's kind of different. The same things that they use for this satanic panic, this moral panic of, these young people with pentagrams and upside down crosses, Cal. That is now being fully commercialized. You'll find pentagram tops in like fast fashion stores, Dark Lord plushies. In the 80s, this would have made people's head explode, or they'd probably start walking up walls in fear. And how did this happen? How did we go from moral panic to mainstream fashion? People were saying Dungeons and Dragons is demonic. Ah yes, Billy the 14-year-old who is a level 12 cleric truly is a threat to society. On top of this, horror movies, heavy metal, threat to society, Cal. Horror, evil, heavy, bad. Dun 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 dun. No, literally, people were playing songs backwards to try and work out if it was the devil communicating with them. Obviously, kids found this interesting and they were like, oh my gosh, is this true? And parents, well, they were losing their minds, ripping their hair out and, headbutting the wall and should have been like, we should have sent him to summer camp. Honestly, mass hysteria everywhere. No actual logic being applied, but just feelings of scared and not understanding things. And goths, who were emerging more and more at this time, well, they were pretty much public enemy number one. Conservative groups, religious organizations latched onto the goth wave, this new subculture that was emerging within youth. And they were like, this is proof Satan is infiltrating our youths. Now, obviously, in modern day, we would laugh and be like, no, this is just someone expressing themselves and rebelling against the societal norms of how one should present and conduct themselves in society, right? But no, like I said, logic had left the chat. This was demons. We were like basically one more season away from people doing like witch trials, basically, at this point. It was seriously not good. But because of this mass hysteria, obviously parents were terrified and talk shows would run sensationalized specials on, anything countercultural, anyone looking a bit gloomy and mysterious. It was demonized. They were demons, Cal. We must stop them. But in reality, as we know, goth was, and still is to this day, a subculture rooted in post-punk music, literature, and, well, this aesthetic. Not devil worship. But, Cal, I know Billy Ricky from down the street, he is goth and he is Satan. Ah, yes. Just like there might be a man called Steve out there who plays tennis and also worships Satan. What I'm trying to say is, to play tennis or to be a goth, there is no mentioning or need to be part of a satanic movement. That's just another interest or belief structure you are part of. But they are not part of goth or tennis. Yeah, glad we can clear that up. But obviously, despite goth not actually being directly linked with satanic worship, this didn't stop any of the accusations, because it was far easier to just demonize anyone that was doing it different than try and understand them, right? Oh dear. But this hysteria in this era called satanic panic got so bad that like bands and artists were all dragged into this. Think bands or artists like Black Sabbath or Alice Cooper, who have different aesthetics to the norm, right? But because they challenge the norms, evil, they're polluting the minds of the youth, Cal. Dangerous. Literally anything outside of the conservative norm was just labeled demonic. And because of this really did leave a mark and legacy issues. Even in like the 90s, and the satanic panic was not as rife and as controlling as it was in the 80s, we had moments where goths or countercultural people would go on talk shows and they were demonized. There's obviously the particularly infamous case, Alan Jr. went on a show who was a goth, and their father hated Alan. They didn't get Alan's ways. Why was Alan like this? But what was Alan Jr.'s crime? Well, just dressing differently and enjoying non-mainstream genres of music. Yet on this show, Alan Jr. was treated as like this suspect of an underground demonic corporation. Like, there was just no logic in these conversations or anything of actual nuance or merit. It's just fearmonger. We don't get it, so let's shame a literal child on TV so we can change them. It's just horrible. It's closed-mindedness, right? At its peak, the satanic panic had these preachers saying, you know, this dark, evil music was letting demons into your homes. And parents were basically convinced that their kids were holding secret sacrificial rituals in like the local cemetery. But the reality, this was all baseless. This was people just conjuring things in their head due to their own insecurities and fears. Have there been incidences in history where people who have, you know, not looked mainstream, have not looked like the everyday person, have committed horrible acts? Yes. Just like there's been a history of people committing heinous, horrible acts that also look like everybody else, right? The reality is that most of these youths that were in countercultural movements during this time, such as goth, were pretty much just rebelling against the norms and expectations put on them via society and maybe their parents, and they just found goth the place that resonated with them. There was no evilness going on there. What's the crime? Them sitting in their room listening to music as they explore their self-identity. Whoa, that's not scary at all, is it? Let's be real. What I found wild when researching for this is you can find literally dozens and dozens of accounts online of people giving what their personal experiences were like during the satanic panic period. For example, this person mentions how their family friends were practicing Wiccans and people would drive past their house screaming things like "burn in hell." Others who mentioned they were Wiccan also said that other kids were not allowed to play with them, they were othered. And what I'm trying to get across here is that although goths were clearly very demonized by the satanic panic era, it went far larger than that. This went to like a worldwide scale of international terror in some ways, where this theme of satanic ritual abuse was put at the forefront of everyone's minds as this very scary, serious thing. And due to this, many were innocently imprisoned, many were taken to trial for things they had not done, all under the guise of something satanic. But to get back on point to goths, if that is something you want me to explore in a future video, just the satanic panic as a whole, I think a really interesting video could be done there. Interesting side note though, I feel I should say, since we're on the conversation of like Satanists, and what does that actually mean? Because I feel if you do just say the word they're a Satanist, you think, what is this like level 10 demon with huge wings and huge horns? Are they gonna like run me down and cast fire cannons out their hands? I don't know, your mind can conjure up anything, right? But there actually are like multiple different variants on a Satanist and what it means to be a Satanist. We have the theistic Satanists who worship Satan as a deity. So in that case, you know, they believe Satan is this real being, not like how I kind of like fear-mongered it in your heads before. I gave the definitions where it was like a person fireballing out their hands. You know, that's just not in the realms of reality. I'm not here to fear-monger and be like, these theistic Satanists get magical demon powers. No, no, no. They just subscribe to the belief that Satan is their deity, just like any other sort of religion that has a deity, right? I'm glad we got that covered. Cool. And then we also have the atheistic Satanists who do not believe in Satan as this deity or this being that is real in this world, but much rather use Satan as a symbol for personal freedom and rebellion. And do you want to know what the big thing here is? The big piece of information that was completely ignored all throughout the satanic panic era. I'm going to get in close. These goths that are around in the 80s, 90s, whatever, most of them weren't even Satanists. They didn't even worship Satan as a symbol for personal freedom and rebellion. That's not what they were interested in. They were just interested in like the music, literature, and aesthetic. Whee! But that didn't matter because all it took was people seeing things like goths wearing crosses or pentagrams and this all black, spooky aesthetic, and they were like, demon! We have a witch! Witch! You know, ugh. I think with that, we should now break down some of the like popular symbols goths have worn in their aesthetic, you know, during this time period that society has demonized and now has attributed or claimed it means they're part of something evil and demonic. Up first, we've got the pentagram, this 5-pointed star, which is like one of the most misunderstood symbols in history, because long before it was associated with, you know, Satanism, it was actually a symbol for protection. It goes back as early as ancient civilizations like Greeks used it to represent harmony, balance, and even mathematical perfection. So how did that go from that to evil, scary, evil. Well, it wasn't until much later on in history where certain occult groups, and a big factor was also Hollywood, rebranded it as something sinister, evil. Another big popular one we see lots of goths wear is the cross. Now, of course, the cross is typically associated with Christianity. Cross-like symbols have appeared in Egyptian, Babylonian, and Celtic cultures, not just Christianity. You know, the cross has had many uses, like representing the 4 seasons, directions, and even the human form. So a goth may adopt a cross for multiple reasons. And also, it is important to note that there are many Christian goths, because like I said, just because you're a goth doesn't have any impact on your belief structure, right? In researching for this video, I found many people who followed various religions who were also a goth. They call themselves a goth. So many of the goths wearing crosses wouldn't have necessarily been doing it in an anti-Christian way, but much rather a play on the symbol's broader meanings. Another popular symbol goths adopted, especially in the 80s, was the ankh. The ankh, of course, is an ancient Egyptian symbol which basically represents life and all that encompasses it. Additionally, in my research for this video, I've seen many people who were goths during the 80s say a reason why lots of goths were, you know, wearing this symbol is because also within fashion and in culture at the time, Egyptian themes had become popular and people were adopting it into their dress senses. And now conversely, I've also seen goths in modern time be like, probably don't wear the ankh. But however, back then, many did wear this symbol, so I felt I should just briefly bring it up in this video. But so now I naturally hear you ask, well, Cal, if goths weren't Satanists, they weren't these evil people, why did they sometimes use occult imagery? Or why did they sometimes use these other symbols? Well, I think goth, just through looking at people through the different, you know, decades, you can see it's clearly linked to mysticism and like rebellion. Pentagrams, crosses, sigils weren't an endorsement of the devil or Satan or whatever. They were far more likely being used to provoke reactions and challenge authority. Because you got to remember, a lot of subcultures start off as a youth culture movement, right? It's typically young people doing this, young people rebelling against their expectations in society, you know, sticking it up to their parents. I know that seems a bit like, oh, whatever now, but like as a kid, you know, that is a big thing I think we all relate to. And there's a reason we typically adopt the very aesthetics parts of subcultures when we are young, because we're exploring our identity. So these big, obvious things we can dress up and look like is like this big to what like your parents and like people of authority in your life want and think you should do. You know, though I never rocked any symbolism or any symbols on my neck or whatever when I was an emo, I definitely remember being like, yeah, wearing these skin tight jeans I got from the ladies section that are like cutting off all blood circulation to my legs, and wearing these like band t-shirts that had like, I don't know, blood and guts on or whatever. This is really sticking it to my parents, who were actually just pretty decent people that loved me regardless. Like, but this is just part of growing up, right? You kind of rebel and you kind of find your footing. And I think this is what a lot of the goths were doing back in the 80s and 90s, or just people in subcultures when they're growing up. You often do the extremes to begin with, and then you find your authentic self down the line. But what is really interesting is if you fast forward to today, to, you know, modern day times, you can basically walk into like any mainstream shop in the high street or just go online and you can find pentagram covered tops or like fast fashion, quickly made pentagrams, or things with 666 on. Things that would have, in the 80s, made people's heads explode. Parents' heads would be like, are now just easily accessible for all. We've even got the Dark Lord from Killstar, I think it's from. I would love to go back in time and show all these people that were fear-mongering about goths and about countercultural movements and show them what today is. Like, this stuff's everywhere. Their heads would explode. They'd be like, Satan's won! But there is an interesting conversation and theme to explore of how, like, this occult imagery that was once provocative and countercultural, and maybe was a sign of rebellion, has now just become another mass-produced aesthetic. And what once probably felt shocking and fueled the argument for satanic panic is now kind of just seen as gimmicky, or they're just going for a phase. I suppose it's because of these fast fashion brands capitalizing on the alternative aesthetics, which are now kind of like the mainstream, is that these symbols no longer hold any meaning. They have become completely detached from the subculture, or what they kind of stood for within the subcultures, right? The aesthetics now are being sold without any ideology, so it's not really alternative or countercultural at all. It's a, well done, you're being sold the pre-packaged version of a subculture. That isn't challenging the normal status quo at all. It's, well, you are the norm. And look, I'm not saying that this makes people bad and whatever. I'm not, clowning on people for this. It's just interesting how things go from being used as part of a movement to, rebel against the mainstream, to it then being sold to the mainstream as something gimmicky and meaningless and without any power or social commentary. It's just there for you to buy. Like, I suppose another example in like social commentary of things being taken and just being sold to the masses is, again, within goth, is like the goth girlfriend. Remember how everybody wanted a goth girlfriend? The goth aesthetic and what encompassed goth got turned into just another mainstream trend rather than part of a subculture or any sort of social commentary or rebellion. It's just this person we can pedestal and all worship. This is the cycle all subcultures just seem to experience. Whether it be punks, whether it be goths, whether it be skinheads, you get the original founding members, the original people of the movement. It then gets misinterpreted by the mass media, so the fear-mongering, and then it gets watered down and sold to the mass public so that it is no longer countercultural, and obviously during that people will profit off it. Kind of think about, I suppose, a big example of someone that arguably really profited off of the satanic panic era and the legacy that left behind was an artist like Marilyn Manson, right? But now we can discuss the next stage of this cycle, which is the resistance. Because if goths have been demonized and then commercialized, are they completely dead, Cal? Are they just no longer a thing? What are the actual goths doing about it, Cal? Well, to put it simply, they are pushing back. There's been a growing movement within goths on TikTok to make it go back to its DIY roots.
An aesthetic is what happens when capitalism gets to a subculture. Just take goth or punk, for example. Prolific subcultures with a deep, rich history. Countercultural movements that are about DIY and thrifting and being anti-capitalist, anti-consumerism. It wasn't enough to just dress punk or goth, you had to be punk or goth. You had to listen to the music, participate in community, and actually believe in the ideology. And then fast fashion got their hands on punk and goth. And you have companies like Shein that are antithetical to, the arch nemesis of ideologies like punk and goth, selling goth clothes or punk clothes. And then you have people who will say, but Shein is the only place where I can find punk clothes. So far removed from what the subculture actually means, because they see it as an aesthetic.
Can you make normal clothes work as goth? Yes, you can. You do not have to buy from goth brands. Mostly about hair, makeup, and accessories. These are all very normal pieces of jewelry. I got them at the thrift store. I think having disheveled hair helps the outfit read as goth. Of course, the makeup. What to look for when buying normal clothes. All the clothes I'm going to show you, I got from uncurated thrift stores, or if it was from a curated thrift store, it was very inexpensive. Actually, if you're trad, or you want to emulate the goths in the 80s, look for actual pieces from the 80s. There is very little demand for 80s clothing secondhand. It's not a trendy decade right now the way the 60s and 70s are. So pretty much all of my 80s pieces I've gotten for very cheap.
I think the important thing to note with content creators like the ones I've just shown is they're not trying to like outright demonize people that may have brought into fast fashion aspects of the goth subculture. What they are simply trying to do is help educate to help preserve what goth is. And obviously I can see from just reading comments that many people point out that they don't know how to go about getting hold of vintage gothic clothes. They are under the illusion that it is very costly. So having these content creators give their tips and also how they make some of their gothic pieces can be really useful to help people move away from buying the mass-produced, pre-made gothic aesthetic things and actually take it back to its creative, expressive DIY roots. It was actually really interesting because I saw conversations of goths who were alive in the 80s and who were presenting as goth then, and they're saying how, in one way, it's amazing the modern day world that the new goths, baby bats, have so much information and so many things at their disposal. But they said it's also like a double-edged sword because of that, there's no reason to engage with it authentically as a sense of rebellion, but because you can just go online and order something from Amazon and hey presto, you look like a TikTok goth. And that is engaging with something without any substance, just looking the part. We're in this time where there's so much information available to us, that in some ways it can make us lazy and not actually authentically engage. Before goth was this mass-produced, commercialized, sold to the masses, packaged thing, goths were making their own clothes, modifying garments to reflect their personal style. I also saw other goths from the era of the 80s also contribute that, like, they shared and they modified together because that's all they had. It's not like you could just go and get things. So because you had to go out of your way and find these few pieces and make them gothic, it actually got people authentically engaging with each other, and that created a sense of community. But whereas now online you can just type in goth on Amazon or on Shein and order stuff, it creates this disconnect from you and other goths, and that in that case it's no longer a subculture. It literally is just an aesthetic. And this is the thing, this dark aesthetic that has been, you know, associated with goth. There's no like indistinguishable thing on the internet for like the everyday person. If you just type in dark aesthetic, it will show you goths, it will show you emos, it will show you all of these things. But because this has been taken over by capitalism, by people profiting off of it, we now have the countercultural movement from people within the goth subculture who aren't just doing it for the aesthetic, for the likes, clicks and engagement. They're doing it for the movement, who are pushing back and being like, hey, no, if you want to be part of the goth movement and not just like the aesthetic gothic in style, but an actual goth, then we should bring back the importance of the DIY nature. And I think that's a nice thing to see, taking it back to its roots and honouring that, right? I also do want to say that like goths aren't doing it in like a gatekeepy way, being like, nobody can dress spooky unless you're an actual goth and you practice DIY. I've seen so many comments of goths acknowledging, look, if you just like the darker aesthetics in life, that's cool, do your thing, whatever. They're not policing that. They're just saying if you claim to be goth, an actual goth, then maybe keep to its core values, right? That's all they're saying. I think the important thing to remember with all of these things and with subcultures, with countercultural movements is if you are buying it online from a big mainstream platform, you're probably not part of the countercultural movement. And that's not me being mean and obtuse, but subcultural movements, countercultural movements are never in the forefront. They're never in the mainstream. So if you're finding them in the mainstream, it's probably the commercialized, watered down version of them. And that's not me shitting on you if you like that. I'm just saying it's not the authentic original thing. Yeah, if you want to wear your pentagram 666 Devil Slayer top from, I don't know, H&M or whatever, fine, cool, whatever. I just wouldn't go around saying you're the original Goth Lord 6000. Probably, I think. But it is interesting, right, how that is now the reality. These tops with 666 on devils, pentagrams, all these things that were part of the satanic panic are now just, let's sell you packaged rebellion. Yeah, that little phase. Ooh. So what have we learned through this random conversation? Goth was clearly never satanic. Otherwise there would have been so much more news and information about all goths being satanic. But the essence of goths in the aesthetic side is that it was just a rebellion against social norms, not hailing Satan. Yeah, this is just the sad realities of subcultures. They're demonized and they're commercialized for that same things they were demonized for. And then now in present day times, it is resisted by the actual members of the subcultures. So demonized, commercialized, then resisted. And resisting shouldn't be seen as gatekeeping or policing. It's people just trying to uphold what these movements were about. But honestly, it's a testimony to the goth subculture. It survived moral panics, fear-mongering, corporate co-opting, but despite all of that, it still thrives in many ways as a DIY independent subculture, which is cool. It's nice to see people expressing themselves authentically and going against the grain in the way that they feel is authentic to them. Yes, sweet. Okay, cool. I'm now going to pass this conversation over to the viewer because I feel I've said everything I want to say, and that's my chair squeaking, by the way. Nothing odd is going on, don't worry. Anyways, I've been your boy Cal. I've stopped doing show and tell recently, mainly because I'm just sorry if you're new here, I do show and tell at the end of every video, just to do like a decompression from the topic we've been talking about. But I've stopped doing them recently because I'm selling off a lot of my collections just due to changes in my personal life. And that's not me being like, oh, feel bad for me, doom and gloom, pity vote like on X Factor or something. It's just, hey, this is just the nature of life. Sometimes you got to sell your stuff off and then you can always buy it back again in the future. So currently I have nothing to show for show and tell. Not really. Not that I can. Oh, I do. Do you want to see who produces my videos? Well, I've made it like the silly Cattle's Life lore. Of course you do. You have no choice. You're watching this video. Oh, he's actually behind lots of things. This is producer Elmo. I made it like canon lore. Well, actually, Elmo was gifted to me. They're like, Cal, it's your producer, because obviously I work alone on these videos. So I just sat them in the back of my area where I work on videos, and it's funny to think that this person produces my videos. I gave them my busted headphones and a pair of glasses that look like mine. Anyways, that's producer Elmo. I'm going to put them back now. Also, they're wearing my Top Golf medal from when I won at Top Golf. I actually came third place, apparently. I suck. Anyways, I'm Cal. You're the viewer. I'm going to go now. Okay. See you later. Seriously, see you later. Okay, bye. No, go, bye. 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 I'm going now. Seriously, go. Okay, I don't know what I'm doing. I almost said bye. Okay. Bye.